Negative painting in watercolor is a really cool and helpful technique to learn. Painting trees is my favorite way to practice it, so in this demo, I will show you a few different ways I like to do negative painting. I'm actually going to start with some positive painting here, and you will see why in a bit. But also I like to mix positive and negative painting. For those that aren't familiar with this technique, the idea is to paint the space between shapes. So instead of painting the trees directly, you paint the area around and between the trees, for example. Watercolor is a transparent medium, so we are supposed to use the white of the paper for our whites, which makes getting comfortable painting the in-between space really handy. Plus, there's just something about negative painting in watercolor that looks really great. As I rough in my positive tree shapes, you can see I started with my cooler colors, but then started to drop in hints of warmer colors before transitioning to a warmer purple color at the bottom. Yes, I could have painted the whole grouping of trees a solid green color, but that would be boring, and I'm not really into boring. I waited a few minutes and my paint is starting to dry, so I'm coming in with a rather wet brush loaded with blue-green paint to get it to bloom. When your paper is getting close to dry and your brush is really wet, that's the time when you get the biggest blooms, which can be good if you want it to bloom, or bad if you didn't know it would happen. I'm gradually roughing in some what will be grass here at the bottom. I'll add more detail to it a little bit later, but I don't want it to get too crazy with detail on it. I like to paint negative trees by starting where I want the top of the tree to be, and then paint a triangle down around where I want the tree, and I sort of nudge the paint in here and there to start giving it a tree-like shape. Now don't be too worried about how funky your trees look. When you have a grouping of trees, individual trees can look pretty wacky, and no one will actually notice. In my opinion, painting trees is more like dancing and less like a science experiment. I'm trying to give them some character. I'm not trying to precisely copy a photograph, although it can be helpful to have a tree reference photo to look at, but I'm trying to practice being loose with my shapes. I'm hinting at spots where you can see the tree trunk every once in a while, and also adding spots where some branches are missing or places where you can see daylight through the middle of a tree. I think this helps our shapes to read more like trees, but again, I'm more trying to practice being loose here and less worried about how perfect each individual tree is. When I am painting, I always have a brush in each hand. My main brush in my right hand has paint on it, of course, but my left hand always has a brush for blending with just clean water on it that can be quickly swapped to my right hand. Throughout this video, you will notice I come in to blend colors to make a smooth transition with this brush. I'm looking for nice sharp lines around my tree shapes, but then I want the paint on the other side to blend into the background. Once the paint is completely dried on your first layer of negative trees, you can start on a second layer. I think the layering of negative shapes in watercolor looks particularly cool, so try multiple layers to see what happens. By the way, you will notice that I'm using warm colors for my background trees. My plan for this painting is for it to be a warm dominant painting, so the majority of the painting should end up being warm colors, with a small amount of it being cool colors. I'm planning to make the large grouping of darker trees on the right side of my painting my center of interest. So I'm hoping the big area of cooler colors in my center of interest will contrast with all the warm colors in the rest of my painting, and help my center of interest stand out more. Now that my trees are dry, I'm going to start lightly washing paint over the trees in my second and third layers. I have mostly water on my brush with a little bit of paint, as I want this wash to be transparent so you can still see the outlines of those trees, but I want to try to give some depth between the layers. When doing these washes over the background layers, I'm actually trying not to exactly follow the shapes of my first layer of negative trees. I want some subtle differences here and there, as I think this gives the transparent layers a fun look. Next, I'm going to start layering negative shapes on my dark blob of trees to start giving them some definition and depth. Speaking of dark, I should mention my value plan for this painting. And by value, I mean how light or how dark something is. It is easiest to simplify the values in your painting to just 3 values: lights, midtones, and darks. It is a good rule of thumb to pick one of those 3 values to be the dominant value of your painting. Do you want your painting to be moody and dark, a light picture, or somewhere in between? Whatever you decide, you should make the majority of your painting that value. So my value plan for this painting was to be something like 70% midtones, 20% darks, and 10% lights. We'll see how close I actually get to that, but I think it's a good idea to at least have a rough plan ahead of time. I would like my first layer of negative trees to stand out a little more, so I'm adding touches of dark here and there around them, and then I'm using my blending brush to blend in the darks. I'm trying to get a little more depth between layers of trees. Lifting tree trunks out with an old brush and just clean water is a helpful technique to use when painting trees. Now I'm going to rough in some foreground bushes and grass, but I don't want to get too carried away with detail here. I more want to hint that there are bushes and grass. There's always a temptation to paint every single detail in a scene, but I want to go light on how detailed I get in the less important areas of my painting and be more detailed closer to my center of interest. As I start finishing up my painting, I'm working on increasing the contrast by darkening my darks near my center of interest, and with a big flat brush, I'm doing some light washes to make it look like parts of the scene are in shadow and the sun is only hitting certain areas of the picture. Lighting to me has always seemed like such a challenging thing to do well in paintings. However, I have discovered that if you start out with some really light washes, you can always keep adding more layers of shadow until you like it. I do recommend using a bigger brush than you'd like for shadows. I love putting shadows on the ground, as they give you a better sense of the shape of the terrain. As with trees, I want to give my shadows some character. I don't want to just paint perfectly straight lines for shadows. I want my shadows to sort of go up and down a little so that maybe you feel like there's a little bit of a hill or something. Let me know in the comments if you try painting negative trees after watching this video, if you have any other questions regarding negative painting, and if you think I'm being too much of a negative Nancy and shouldn't be so negative all the time.